Thank you so much to our cantorial intern, David Fair, and to our music director, Joyce Rosenzweig. And thank you to all of you for your patience with us as we're trying to learn this new reality to be able to create sacred space with all of you. And I'm very grateful for so many things this week, even though it's been a very difficult week. We lost the first person in our community to die from COVID-19. Last night, we had a Shiva Minyan, Patrice Ruel's father. Patrice, who was a longtime member of the synagogue and a beloved staff member, his father died this week. And last night we had a virtual Shiva Minyan, which was so beautiful. 150 people came together to surround Patrice and his family, his mother, Ida, who is also sick, and his sister and his brother, and there are others who are sick in the family. And we were able to be there together in this new normal. So while we have to find these ways of creating opportunities and strengthening each other and ourselves with what we as a synagogue community know how to do, which is to be together in community. We don't have the ability to make the bad things disappear. We don't have the ability to solve these problems that the world is facing right now. But we do have a lot of power, and the power of showing up, the power of being the people who will bring a sense of goodness to those who are most suffering at this moment. That never stops. I want to tell you a story that some of you have heard about one of my mentors. He's not a mentor I ever met. He's a mentor I only know intellectually through his books and his teachings. And I have several of them who play a really profound role in my spiritual life and in my intellectual expansion, really. And this is Martin Buber. When I was in Jerusalem most recently, which was only in, I guess it was February, I was in Jerusalem, and it's been I wanted to find Buber's house in the neighborhood of Abu Tur, where he lived. He moved to what was Palestine, of course, at the time in the 1930s, and lived in Abu Tur until 1948. Abu Tur was an Arab neighborhood in which he lived very comfortably. And he brought with him from Berlin, when he arrived in Palestine from leaving as a refugee, the anti-Semitic, genocidal, heinous Nazi Europe. When he came to Jerusalem, he brought with him what was perhaps at the time the greatest personal Judaical library that existed in the world. And he brought it with him to Jerusalem. Very few other people had the collection that Martin Buber had in the 1930s when he arrived in Jerusalem. And in 1948, the war broke out, as we all know, and there was tremendous fighting in Jerusalem and in the surrounding areas. And Buber and his wife had to flee from their home in Abu Tur. And he had to leave Abu Tur, and he ended up living in a different neighborhood in West Jerusalem through the 1960s. He couldn't take any of his books with him, this greatest of all libraries that he had. And he found out some years later that his Arab neighbor took every single one of his books, and there were thousands and thousands of them, packed them up in boxes and hid them in the basement of his house, knowing or hoping that one day he would be able to reunite Buber with those books. I wanted to find the house Buber lived in Abu Tur, and I went with my friend, Rabbi Noah Satat, and she helped me find it, and we stood at the house. By the way, there's no plaque on this house that Buber lived in. There's no notification of any kind that this was the house of one of the greatest thinkers of our people. But we stood there looking at the view from his porch, what he has looking over the old city from Abu Tur, and thinking of this story about the Arab neighbor saving the books. And I told that story once again, and then I thought to myself, am I sure the story is correct? Is this an apocryphal story that's fed me all these years, but I'm not sure if it's actually true? So I wrote to my professor, Professor Paul Mendes Floor, who was my teacher of Buber and of Rosenzweig, the two great scholars of the 20th century. When I lived in Israel in the 1980s, I studied with Paul Mendes Floor at the Hebrew University. And I wrote to him, and he's recently retired. And I said to him, do I have this story right? Did I remember this correctly? And he responded, and he said, the story is absolutely correct. I remembered it from Paul Mendes Floor. And not only that, but Paul Mendes Floor knew his name, told me his name, gave me details about his family. And I think about that story a lot. What would it take in the middle of war, in the middle of a terrible crisis, that this neighbor thought of taking the books, of saving the books of a scholar for one day in the future? He had no idea when it would be, that this scholar, a Jewish scholar, would get his books back. That's a belief in the future that teaches me a lot about what it means to believe, to have hope, and to keep acting in ways that we want to see ourselves be. We don't want to act in ways that we'll be ashamed of at another time. I want to speak a little bit more about Martin Buber, and some of you have heard these words before, but I think they're so relevant to us today who are in social isolation, but struggling to find spiritual and personal connections in this moment of crisis. Buber taught, and I learned this book, and I studied this with Dr. Paul Mendes Floor. In his book, I and Thou, he taught about a relationship with God, what was found in the tzvishen, in the in-between, in the relationship between things, not in the things themselves. So he said, and I'm oversimplifying, remembering that people think I speak too long. I'm going to try and be as brief as I can. Buber said, in the I-thou relationship, or in other words, in the German informal relationship of I-you rather than I-it, we must find ways to relate to things, not in the ways that they functioned for us, but in finding relationships that exist between us. And let me explain what that means. Buber said there are three areas in which we can most easily access what it means to feel God's presence in our lives. And he said it wasn't intellectual. These are the three areas that he said we could most easily access God. If you've ever been in nature and all of a sudden you're not just looking at the tree as a thing from which you could get wood to build something, or the thing from which you could take in order to have something to eat, or a thing that will provide you with shelter of some kind. But if you all of a sudden looked at a tree, or looked at the ocean, or was on the hilltop, or you were in the woods by a stream, or you were in some spectacularly beautiful place, or maybe you just saw a single flower, or a single daffodil coming up, or a single crocus coming up from an urban sidewalk, or a single little flower, purple flowers that are coming up now, or the forsythia, and you lost your breath a little bit, or you looked at that and you saw not just that flower, not just that tree, not just that body of water, not just that leaf, not just that flower, but you saw infinity. You understood that this flower was created in the image of God just as you were. As I said last week, Alice Walker says it so beautifully in her book, The Color Purple. If you pass by a field of purple flowers and you don't stop to notice it, it pisses God off. So Buber would say that moment where you engage with those purple flowers and you see deep beauty in the natural world, that is an I-you, an I-thou relationship. It's the tzvishen, it's the in-betweenness, it's the beinenut, the in-betweenness between you and what you're looking at. In there, in that in-betweenness is where you can experience God. Buber said it was also true about art or the creative fields altogether. You could look at a painting or hear a piece of music. I can't create art, so I can only imagine. I'm so jealous of people who can create music or can create art. But for sure, I experience it as the word consumer is a bad word, as someone who engages with art passionately. Being in an art museum brings me such deep joy and such a deep sense of God's presence. Have you felt that? Have you felt it when you've looked at a beautiful piece of sculpture or a beautiful painting? And it could be a painting that's done by your 4-year-old, or listen to a great piece of music, a glorious moment of music. And you have felt the world has shifted from being prosaic and it's become poetic. In that tzvishin, in that moment, Buber would say, is where God is found. And the third area that Buber describes is in human relationships. Now, this can be most challenging, perhaps, because so many of us are separated from each other physically. But Buber would say it's not about physical proximity, that human relationship, if you are engaged, and think about this, if you've experienced this, it could be with a close friend. It's the difference between a conversation where you're just passing a small piece of information, or you're telling somebody to turn left or turn right, or the store is open now, or come to class at 9 a.m. But then there's a conversation you can have with a friend that somehow is so elevated, or the experience of being seen and understood and heard and loved in between you and the friend, at that moment is God's presence. That's the tzvishin, that's the in-betweenness, that's the beinenut in which God is found. In these times of profound separation and physical isolation, I believe Buber has a lot to teach all of us, which is that we have to remember that God can be found in relationship. You can look out your window and look for something beautiful in the natural world, or a flower you have in your house, or a plant you have, or an image you have, and experience God's presence. You can do it with art anywhere. And I've been so moved by the incredible creativity of these musicians all over the world, these orchestras who are all isolated in their homes, finding ways to create music that then brings such depth to my life, or these artists who are doing likewise such creative things with technology. But all I have to do is to lie down and put on a piece of music, and I have a few go-tos that all I know for sure, this particular recording of this particular piece of music, if the rest of my world is quiet for a few minutes, I'll experience something that I know from Buber is exactly where God is. And so too, we have to do that with our friendships, our connections right now that are under so much pressure because of the isolation we feel. We have to find ways to not only focus on the isolation, but find ways to deepen the connections that we experience with other human beings. To have those conversations that are a little bit more heightened and maybe a little bit more meaningful because of the moment we're in. Or chat with a friend who can really understand you. We have to use technology perhaps to do it, but Buber would say that technology is not an obstacle to God's presence. And I believe that if we actively work on creating more of these, as Buber would call them, tzvishin moments of I-thou moments, of focusing on the in-between, even with the technology, I feel God's presence will bring us a lot of comfort and strength and joy. I believe that although God might feel hidden from many of us, that by our exploring ways in which we bring God's presence into our life, we're saying to God, don't hide your face from us. Don't be hidden from us. We will find ways to bring light and joy and love into our lives. Don't despair, because God's presence is found in all these ways that Buber has described. And I think of that Arab fellow who committed his life and put himself at danger to save those books. That library, by the way, still exists because of that. And indeed, Buber was reunited with the books later in his life. Be the reason people believe in the goodness of other people. We're in a moment in history where New Yorkers are now being identified as the ground zero of this COVID-19. Where we're being identified as the source, or at least the center of these terrible things. We have to know we New Yorkers have been through terrible things before, and those of us who are here in New York City say to the rest of the world, our light, our chutzpah, our souls will survive. It's true that not each one of us literally will survive. But this community of CBST, because of all of us building it, putting our little pieces of love and light into it, will create a foundation for the future, and we will create this foundation together. So I pray that each of you in this coming week finds ways to increase the tzvishin, the in-betweenness in your lives, to feel God's presence in every moment that you can. It can't be every moment of the day. We have tough lives now, but try in every moment that you can to be aware, to be conscious, and to be in focus on the tzvishin that we can create. Shabbat Shalom.